After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So before we get into this powerful, disturbing story that has perhaps generated more commentary over 2,000 years and more than any other text in the Hebrew Bible, we have to grapple a little bit with the legacy of the Aqedah, as it's called in Hebrew, from the word for binding. And even to start there recognizes a distinction between Jewish and Christian interpretations, in that Christian interpretations tend to call this story the binding of Isaac, whereas Jewish ones start with the variation of the Hebrew word Aqedah. So we're going to have to grapple with that, and whether you're a Jew or a Christian atheist or not sure, having to clear the air of what previous interpretations have left perhaps in the back of our minds is really important to be able to enter into the story. So next time I will enter into the story detail by detail, but this time we're just going to go over the legacy to kind of clear that space as we go. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, I'm going to go through some of the elements historically. I won't go through everything, as I'll show you many books and articles have been written on this. Just for instance, in the last decade, we have these. So from Beach and Powell, Interpreting Abraham, which has chapters in summarizing Jewish, Christian, and Muslim views, but also has a series of articles summarizing philosophical views, starting with Kierkegaard, and as we'll look at in a little bit when we get to Kierkegaard, other philosophers all the way up until Jacques Derrida. So there's that one. In 2017, we have Megan Warner's Reimagining Abraham, and I've been using Megan Warner's work in the material on chapter 20 and 21. But in this book, she examines the story in light of Deuteronomistic influence on this story. So she's doing a scholarly thing there. Aaron Kohler's Unbinding Isaac in 2020 is a relatively popular, accessible book, although he's certainly a scholar, Jewish scholar, and he's grappling what the effect of the legacy of Kierkegaard is on Jewish interpretations and decrying that and trying to open some space beyond Kierkegaard for Jewish interpretation. And then Richard Middleton's Abraham's Silence in 2021, writing as a Christian, trying to reinterpret the story based on some intertextual details that he's found, and having a long history of the tradition that he explores, and reading this in light of the book of Job. So his book is really about the binding of Isaac, or the Aqedah, and Job together. So those are just 4 full-length books on this story in the last 10 years. And the story itself is 19 verses, which to say it's like one long paragraph, and yet it's generated several 300-page books, and hundreds of philosophical articles, biblical scholarly articles, and popular material. If you go on the internet and just search for this, you'll find many websites that purport to offer you an interpretation of that. So we're trying to cut through some of that to get to the essence of what's going on. So we'll go through this little outline on the right side one step at a time. So most traditional interpretations are defensive of both God and Abraham. And John Levinson's book, The Death and Resurrection of the Son of God, is perhaps the best recent explanation of that. I didn't put it on my list because it's from the 90s, but it's had great influence. And notice that he's putting a title on that, even though he's a Jewish scholar, that makes it sound like it's about Jesus. And part of what he's doing is grappling with the legacy of how Christians have interpreted this. And from a Christian perspective, there are 2 ways of coming at this. One is exemplified by Walter Moberly, is as an expression of the right attitude toward God, especially when it comes to offering sacrifice. But another way to read that as a Christian, and this was common in the early church especially, and in my book, Empire Baptized, I explore the legacy of early Christian interpretation, which was largely based on Platonic views and read these things allegorically. So they read it not in its own context, but as a type, which is to say an ancient, not a prediction as such, but as a form of the story that then becomes manifest in the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, as scholars immediately recognize, ancient scholars and modern, it's not the same, because Jesus actually does die and obviously Isaac doesn't. So it's not the same. But that's to say that's a critique of the Christian interpretation, not what the Christian interpretation is. So Moberly and Levinson have become the most recent exponents of this traditional interpretation. And part of what's at stake is defending God and Abraham, which is to say these texts are found in Scripture, whether the Hebrew Bible for a Jew like Levinson or the Bible as a whole, the Old Testament, if you want to call it that, from a Christian like Moberly. And so they want to defend the goodness of God and the goodness of Abraham in the story. And there are many ways to do that, and many scholars have done that, but that's not the only way to do it, and as we'll see. So other Jewish interpretations, and one that's been very powerful, sees this story as at the root of the Jerusalem Temple project. And that might seem a stretch, but it's connected to the question of the land of Moriah, which you can see here on the left side of the screen. Go to the land of Moriah, which is only mentioned one other place in the entire Bible, and let's look at that, and it's right here in 2 Chronicles here, 3:1, which is the retelling of the story in the books of Samuel and the book of Kings. So this verse here is not in the book of Kings. Solomon began to build the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where Yahweh had appeared to his father David at the place that David had designated on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Now, there's a lot going on there, but as my note on the right side of the screen is, and I won't go to all that, this reference of David building an altar, which isn't mentioned here, but being on the threshing floor of a Jebusite is in 2 Chronicles 24:16-24, where the Jebusite has a different name, but the point of the story there in the very last verses of 2 Samuel is that David had decided wrongly to conduct a census, which led to punishment of not only him but all of the people from Yahweh, and to end that suffering, he decides to build an altar on the threshing floor of this Jebusite. Why there isn't said, but it's not mentioned where it is in 2 Samuel, except that it's in Jerusalem. So it's the text of 2 Chronicles that links all three texts together, that says that the place that David bought the threshing floor was at Mount Moriah, and that's where Solomon built the temple. And that suggests that the temple was built because of the merit of Abraham in being so faithful that he would offer Isaac as God had called. That's one way to read it, but we don't have to read it that way. Another way that was read early on and continued to be over many centuries is an inspiration for martyrdom. And that's curiously ironic there, because martyrdom involves self-sacrifice. It doesn't involve killing somebody else. It involves deciding that out of faithfulness one will sacrifice one's own life. And we see that in the story in 2 Maccabees 7, a 2nd century BCE text that tells the story of a mother with 7 sons who all die horribly under the Seleucid tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and yet die to remain faithful. And then a few centuries later, the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, which is the final stage of the Jewish-Roman war after the time of Jesus, you can see there in the 130s of the Common Era, was inspired by that as well. And the same idea that to die for faith was better than to live unfaithfully. So those are some of the traditional Jewish interpretations, but most modern interpretations are shaped by what I'm calling here the Kierkegaard effect. And here he is with his classic book, Fear and Trembling. When I had undergrads try to read this, most of them just scratched their head, not knowing how to parse Kierkegaard's thick, in translation, Danish philosophical existentialism there, later inspiring others like Kafka, who also wrote on this passage. But what Kierkegaard there is, he's obviously grappling, I shouldn't say obviously, because maybe you haven't read Kierkegaard, but in the context of his time, he's grappling with the moribund sense of what Christian faith is. That in the Denmark of his time, Christianity is part of the bourgeoisie. You just go to church, a respectable person goes to church, and it doesn't really shape your life any other than that you're part of the church community. And so he's asking the question, what does faith really look like in our world? And he takes this story and grapples with it as an expression of his concern. But notice what he's starting with. He's not starting with the story in its context, or even with the book of Genesis. He's using the story to, as an example, to grapple with his issue, which has nothing directly to do with the story of Genesis, but everything to do with 19th century bourgeoisie in Denmark. And he presents it as a conflict between faith and ethics. And I'm not going to try to grapple with all of Kierkegaard's understanding, because I'm going to do something different. But the basic sense of it is the often translated leap of faith, which is attributed to him, although as Kierkegaard scholars note, he never actually uses that term, is to say that ethics has to do with behavior that we can talk about and think about rationally. That we can come up with reasons for why someone should behave this way or not behave that way. And that in the story of the the Aqedah, Abraham and humanity are presented with a God who calls out of faith actions which cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized. No matter how much Abraham tries to make sense of the call, he cannot. And so he leaps in the sense of just trusting in faith in God. It's also a term from Kierkegaard's work that we call, that we associate with him, that one believes because it's absurd. And one of the dark sides of the Kierkegaard effect, which he certainly never intended, was so-called blind faith, that people should just believe because God said so or because it's in the Bible. And we find that among many fundamentalists, but that's certainly not what he had in mind at all. He was an intellectual of deep penetration, and was certainly not about checking your mind at the door, except when reason failed. So you use reason to make as much sense as you can, but sometimes he's acknowledging faith takes us beyond reason. Reason is just one tool, and it's not the only tool. And that has had an enormous effect, whether people have read Kierkegaard or not, because it turns the story into an abstraction. It takes it out of its narrative context and makes it an illustration of a philosophical question. And whatever the authors of Genesis were, they were not philosophers in either the modern sense or in the Greek sense in the later centuries before the Common Era, or in the outcomes in the Common Era that shaped Christian thought through the so-called Church Fathers. And so that's one of the things that Kohler in his Unbinding Isaac was trying to explain and take apart, and I think he does an amazingly good job of it. But there are also critical readings, and both Levinson and Levinson and Moberly try to fight against those readings because they see them as unfaithful. But other writers, not being bound by them, continue to ask questions. And the general set of questions that those fall into are these: is God a monster for requiring child sacrifice? Is Abraham a monster for being willing uncritically to do this, given how much he argued with God over the fate of Sodom, where he only knew Lot in that town and not having his own beloved son? Or are the authors monsters in presenting this kind of behavior and this kind of God as something that ought to be emulated? And there are a number of ways that people respond to this basic feeling beyond just that. People can respond to that from a philosophical perspective or other, but there are certain ways where people's status and social location shape the questions they ask. So one of those is a feminist perspective. And feminists have argued over this text for decades, especially since Phyllis Tribble, one of the earliest biblical critics from a feminist perspective, actually affirmed the story, and many feminist critics have criticized both Tribble's reading and others around the question of what about Sarah? Now, where is Sarah in all this? And if you don't know, at the end of the story, Sarah is not there. And so one wonders whether, from a feminist perspective, if Sarah might have modified Abraham's impulse to do this crazy thing. So they grapple with that. From another perspective, black, indigenous, and people of color or liberation perspective authors struggle with a God who calls for the death of innocents and children, given how many times black people, indigenous people, and others have experienced people claiming that their death is God's will. So whether that's the legacy of slavery, or in Latin America, the legacy of a Catholic Church that sometimes supported death squads and others, struggling with a story that would seem to support the idea that God would call for the death of children. Levinson and Moberly's response to these is to say that these readings are based on our criteria of perceptions, not those of the text world, and it's not fair to lay on ethical or other experiential concerns that are not those of the text. But others respond in turn, why should we assume that Abraham is meant to be a model of faith? And much of that comes from the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, in Hebrews 11, where the author goes through a series of characters from the Hebrew Bible to present them as models of faith, and Abraham is presented as one for being willing to offer up Isaac, along with Moses and others who are presented there. And so many Christian readings feel, since that's scripture, they need to defend that reading. But many scholars reading the text on its own terms really question that, and we're going to question that as well. So the alternative that I'm going to offer here to cut through all this is contextual reading, which is to say we will take account of the story within the detailed narrative which is embedded, which in this case is chapters 20 and 21 in particular. Now, many modern scholars take account of the entire Abraham story. They say, well, we have to go back to Genesis 12, and we will in my next video, and we have to recognize the entire story of Abraham's relationship with Yahweh or Elohim, two names for God in this story, before we get to this chapter. And they usually do that by offering a page or two of just summary of the story before. That's not what I'm proposing. And based on Megan Warner's work and others, we're going to see how this story flows directly out of what we've seen in chapter 20 and 21. And if we don't take account of that, we will jump to a wrong conclusion. That many of the conclusions of these various interpretations come from abstracting the story from its own context. And one of the effects of the Kierkegaard story is to see it as a matter for individuals, that the story is primarily about individuals making choices, as opposed to what we're seeing in the story that, of course, it is Abraham making a choice, but Abraham isn't there just for himself. He's there, as are his children, to become nations, to become a whole communities of people for others. And certainly the Genesis audience was not just a bunch of individuals, but people, whether in the exilic or post-exilic communities, trying to discern together what their relationship was with God and with the empires around them, the Babylonian or the Persian. So whether we look at modern authors like Middleton, who is grappling with some of those things, and you can take his view, or what I'm going to do, we need to recognize that none of these are the right answer. One of the things that all these authors, including the wonderful work of the Jewish Midrash, which I'll incorporate into my reading as we go, what they note is the story has many gaps. And as Meyer Sternberg taught me and many people in his classic book, The Poetics of Biblical Narrative from the 1980s, how to read the gaps in the Hebrew Bible, that the authors purposely tell stories that leave spaces to allow readers to interpret them in multiple ways. And the Midrash clearly shows that, because the Midrash shows different rabbinical views arguing with each other without trying to get to a right answer. That sense of a right answer comes from the Greek influence, where there was an understanding that truth and words had a direct one-to-one relationship, so you could get right meanings. But the Jewish tradition has never gone down that road, whether as authors or interpreters, and I'm not going to go down that road either. So what we'll do in the next couple of videos is try to read the story closely in its context, not because what I'm doing is the right answer, because I'm hoping I'm providing a perspective that takes account of many, many authors whose work I've incorporated into my own understanding, but provides an angle that fits into what I've been doing in the rest of these Genesis videos. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. That'll be our next video. See you then. Bye-bye.